Hi everybody, Jorge here, and today I want to talk about one very dangerous concept in our culture, and that is a minority problem. So, very often when we rationalize our indifference and inaction and inertness when it comes to some aspect of social injustice, we do so by portraying that aspect as an issue only affecting a minority of people. A numerical minority, I mean. So it's part of that narrative where the majority of society holds unearned privilege and the minority is being systemically excluded, oppressed, disempowered, marginalized, dehumanized. And since that group of people targeted with injustice and trauma is small compared to society as a whole, it becomes easy for us to say, why should we as society really give a shit? So why should we talk about white supremacy and the history of racism in America if African Americans only make up around 14% of the population in the U.S. today? Or why should we give a shit about homophobia if LGBT people comprise less than 5% of society worldwide? Or why should we give a shit about Islamophobia and anti-Muslim violence if Muslim people make up less than 2% of the American population? So why should we give a shit? Those people are so few. They just don't matter in the big scheme of things. Their lives don't matter. Their trauma doesn't matter. And that's what we get when we frame any kind of social injustice as a minority problem. It becomes a problem of minor significance. And this framing just doesn't represent reality. Because it's a myth that oppression only targets minorities. The most glaring proof of that is sexism. Sexism targets women. 50% of the population, one half of the population. They aren't a minority in terms of populational proportion. But sexism works the exact same way as racism and homophobia and Islamophobia. It works through stereotyping and dehumanization and denial of opportunity and institutionalized oppression. So we can't even technically call it a minority problem, but it's part of the same culture that informs homophobia, racism, classism, which is what? Which is the culture of power over. So the mechanisms and implications of sexism are pretty much the same as those of racism and homophobia and classism. Most of all, it's about the loss of human potential. Another example here, let's talk about poverty. Americans hate to talk about poverty. In America, poverty is culturally associated with stigma, joblessness, crime, homelessness, addiction, and all the vices of those lazy people who just don't want to find a job. And, it's easy to think that way when we know that according to the last census, which was in 2010, poor people comprise around 16% of the American population. They're a minority. But if we take a deeper look at the same data, it turns out that poverty line used in that census doesn't really reflect poverty in contemporary socioeconomic context. So if a more relevant economic threshold of poverty is applied, we get 30% instead of 16%. There's almost a twofold increase when we make our methodology more adequate. And lo and behold, 1/3, 30%, almost 1/3 of the world's wealthiest nation lives in actual poverty. And even more shockingly, 70% of Americans, which is the majority, are expected to live in poverty for at least 1 year over the course of their lives. That's what looks like a minority problem on the surface, and what we therefore avoid to talk about. But let me tell you, I live in Russia, and here, even according to the humblest poverty metrics, around 80% of the population live in poverty. It's not 18, it's 80. The overwhelming majority of the population. But guess what? Culturally here, we shun conversations about poverty pretty much the same way Americans avoid them. Because in fact, our avoidance of those conversations, both in this country and in America and anywhere in the world, it has nothing to do with the numbers. The reason behind it is our lack of vulnerability and courage. Because those conversations are hard and scary for everybody. People who are traumatized are afraid to talk about it because vulnerability is the greatest casualty of trauma. And because most of the time when they walk into these conversations, they receive no empathy, but instead they have their trauma rationalized and trivialized. And on the other hand, people who hold privilege are just as afraid to walk into these conversations because they risk getting shamed for their unearned advantages. And that shaming also happens a lot. So that's why we're not having enough meaningful conversations about what we're collectively experiencing and what holds back our collective growth. The reason is about vulnerability. It's not about the lack of number of people being affected. It's about our collective lack of vulnerability skills. And, it's heartbreaking, but at the same time, it also clearly points out at the solution. So every time we have a choice in life to either armor up or practice vulnerability, we also have the power to either reinforce this culture of inertia and disengagement and disconnection and complacency, or to shift it. It's not immutable. And vulnerability is not a special talent that only select few people have. It's a skill that everybody can develop and practice, like driving or swimming breaststroke. And vulnerability is hard and scary to practice, but it also opens up access to most meaningful experiences that we can have in life. Joy, belonging, connection, creativity. And when it comes very specifically to social justice, we just have to be honest with ourselves. Honesty is another function of vulnerability. So we just have to be honest. And instead of calling something a minority problem, we just have to say, you know what, we're just so afraid to talk about it. We're just so scared and so ashamed to acknowledge our privilege. We're so scared to acknowledge the trauma of people who we have been conditioned to see as the other. And we're scared to move from this system where only so many people have power to the system where everybody has power and a voice and a seat at the table. We're just fucking scared. Because it's only when we are this uncomfortably honest with ourselves, it's only that we can turn things around and say, you know what, we're afraid, but we're also brave. So we're gonna have this conversation anyway, because it deals with what we're all collectively experiencing, and it's just way too important. Because staying away from this conversation moves us away from our values, freedom, democracy, and equality. So we're gonna have this conversation anyway, and we're gonna invite everybody to the table. And yes, it's gonna be tough and messy and heartbreaking and utterly frustrating at times. But it's also going to be healing and powerful and impactful, because we're not going into conversations about social justice just for the conversation's sake. We're going into them so we could figure out how to affect real, meaningful, and lasting change. We can only do that together. Finally, as I already mentioned in an earlier video, even when you hold privilege in some area of life, not being affected is still a myth. It's a fucking myth. There's an increasing amount of evidence today about how white people are being affected by racism, about how straight people are being affected by homophobia and heterosexism, about how men are being affected by sexism, because, those people who hold privilege, they are affected in different ways than those who are directly targeted with the trauma. But they are still being affected. It's still happening. And it happens through socioeconomic mechanisms that are observable and measurable. If put in very simple words, it's because oppression, no matter how many or how few people are targets, inevitably results in the waste of human potential, and by consequence in economic losses that we all then have to pay for. So the takeaway message is just be brave and call bullshit on framing social injustice as a minority problem every time you hear it. Importantly, stay civil as you challenge people about their assumptions, because shaming people, laying into people, insulting people, or approaching these conversations with anger and self-righteousness, or approaching these conversations with the intention to be the knower, as opposed to sharing what you know, or with the intention to be right as opposed to get things right. Like, this just doesn't work. This is not effective. You have to approach those, like, you have to speak truth to bullshit, all the while staying civil and generous and curious is the only way it works. And also, go into research. Like, just go into research regularly to grow critical awareness and make your arguments evidence-based. Because you cannot fight bullshit with bullshit. When you want to speak truth to bullshit, you have to back your truth up with evidence. And also, be always curious and always willing to reconsider things. Like, certainty is the enemy. Like, actually, just be curious, be willing to reconsider, think critically, and be willing to let go of anything that doesn't serve anymore. And also, importantly, have awareness around your own biases. We all have those. But most importantly, just acknowledge fear and acknowledge vulnerability both in yourself and other people when you walk into conversations about social justice. Because it's only after acknowledging those things that these conversations can finally happen in a real, meaningful, and impactful way. And that's what the world certainly needs more of today. So I do hope you take this message constructively. Please do leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation about this. And if you find this message inspiring, insightful, or helpful, please share it with your friends. As always, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time on Jorge Oro's YouTube channel. For now, keep telling the truth, be brave, stay curious, and show up. Take care, guys. Bye.